This is a re-recording of the presentation Innovating on the Trailing Edge of Technology by Aaron Titus, given January 30th, 2020 at the Silicon Slopes Conference in Salt Lake City, Utah. Aaron Titus is the Executive Director of Crisis Cleanup, a disaster relief technology platform that he will introduce in a moment. He is the President of Mountain West Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, or Mountain West VOAD. It is a 12-state coalition of hundreds of disaster relief organizations from Alaska to the Dakotas. He is also the author of How to Prepare for Everything, a guide to help communities prepare for disruptions instead of disasters. Aaron is an attorney specializing in corporate law, privacy, and civil liberty law. He and his wife Jennifer are the proud parents of 9 children, ages 1 to 14.
Good afternoon. Yes, 9 children, so I never stop training for disasters even when I'm at home. I'll start with these propositions. Competitive markets will solve all problems if you are innovative enough. And there is always a way to monetize any value you create. These are bedrock Silicon Valley principles that just happen to not be true. They each have important exceptions. First, competition creates problems in broken markets. Collaboration solves problems competition cannot, even though collaboration is not profitable. Second, value in broken markets benefits people who cannot pay. Therefore, monetizing value is not always possible. We are at a tech summit, but this presentation is not really about technology. It's about human systems. As technologists, we all need to remember that technology doesn't actually do anything. People do things. Technology makes human systems more efficient. Human systems are not designed, they are discovered. Technology that tries to design rather than enhance human systems will eventually fail. Broken markets exist. Social ills cannot be solved through competition alone. Humans usually act in their own interest, and technology does not produce social good. People produce social good, mainly when it's in their interest. Technology can help people do more good. And producing social good in broken markets always invokes the tragedy of the commons. Crisis Cleanup implements these principles in real life. The system helps volunteers help more people after disasters. It is a sort of Craigslist for disaster cleanup organizations. Humans are hardwired to help others in extremity. After disasters, community groups organize to help their neighbors. These groups often ask Crisis Cleanup to open up a public hotline to take requests from survivors and coordinate cleanup efforts. Disaster survivors call the phone number and ask for help. Volunteers answer the calls in their homes and add them to a shared map. During Hurricanes Michael and Florence, Crisis Cleanup took 65,000 calls. In contrast, the American Red Cross took 19,000 calls during the same time. The prior year, we received 60,000 calls for Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. If you want a graph of my stress levels, just take a look at my server logs. Reputable relief organizations then log in. Those that have capacity claim a case, arrange a time with the homeowner, help clean up, and then mark the case closed. Everyone can see what everyone else is doing. To participate in crisis cleanup, an organization must be on the ground, work with survivors, do cleanup work, and be responsible. This means no clubs or Facebook groups unless they can show a track record of good work. They must be reputable. This means being a member of VOAD, having a recommendation from a VOAD or government agency, or showing a track record of good work. For-profit companies can't have access if they make money from disasters. This means contractors and insurance adjusters are not allowed, but an employer sponsoring volunteers is welcome. We don't often think about this, but each of these nonprofit organizations is a competitor. They compete for grants, brand, recognition, and volunteers. In the faith community, many of them are ideological competitors. Crisis Cleanup creates a safe place for these competitors to transparently coordinate. These rules create trust and transparency. Without these rules, mistrust and competition hurt the overall response. I never intended for crisis cleanup to become a thing when I launched it almost 8 years ago, but it did. Since that time, we've coordinated 139 disasters in 47 states, documenting nearly $1 billion of volunteer service to 80,000 households. For every dollar invested in crisis cleanup, survivors have received $161 in additional services that would have otherwise been wasted when volunteers go home early because they don't know who needs help, show up at a home that has already been helped, or waste time knocking on doors. Crisis cleanup creates a commons of data that benefits the whole community. No single organization controls the data, or by extension, their sister organizations. However, maintaining a commons comes at a cost. In 1833, the Victorian economist William Forster Lloyd shared the now famous allegory of the tragedy of the commons. The story tells of an agrarian town where farmers can graze their cattle on their own land or in a shared community space called a commons. The commons costs nothing to the husbandman, so naturally everyone sends their cattle there to graze. As each person acts in their self-interest, he depletes a common resource to the detriment of the common good. Like the commons, everyone benefits from crisis cleanup, but no single organization wants to pay for it. As the steward of the commons, everyone is thankful that I keep the commons green, and I'm often paid in thank yous. Anyone who's spent their time working in humanitarian or human services is familiar with the tragedy of the commons. Crisis cleanup has conservatively created around $200 million of value, but we cannot monetize that value because it goes to people who can't pay, the survivors who need it the most. In other words, crisis cleanup operates in a broken market, which is the most important concept to understand in humanitarian tech. First, let's illustrate a functioning market. In any functioning market, start with a customer beneficiary who has an external profit opportunity, like sales or investment. As an innovator, you provide a widget or service that helps the customer to get more profit. You sell it to the customer and everyone makes money. Functioning markets encompass traditional markets, including industries that create negative externalities like pollution. The insurance industry is a functioning market. Emerging markets in developing countries are also functioning markets. Functioning markets are defined by structure and incentives rather than size, as I'll demonstrate in a moment. Some functioning markets produce social good, like subsidized green energy or organic produce. Broken markets are usually small, but a broken market is not defined by size. It's defined by structure. Just as before, start with a beneficiary. However, instead of having a large external profit opportunity, the beneficiary has a large external loss, cost, or risk. Innovators develop a widget or service that will minimize that loss. In a functioning market, the beneficiary would be able to buy that service, like insurance. However, in a broken market, the large loss makes it impossible for the beneficiary to pay. Examples of loss, cost, or risks include drug addiction, tornado damage, unemployment, or risk of terrorism. Because they can't pay, someone motivated to help must foot the bill. The funder is usually government, philanthropy, or a private donor. The funder only cares about part of the loss. It never makes the beneficiary whole. For example, a faith community may help with life-preserving assistance, but not with lifestyle assistance as a part of their religious duties. Sometimes the funder gives cash directly to the beneficiary, but more often to a service provider. Service providers include food banks, tutors, cleanup crews, or case managers. In this situation, the funder is not investing in the beneficiary. They will not directly benefit from paying to help someone learn to read or installing drinkable water. So they are incentivized to minimize cost rather than maximize impact or value. In addition, service providers must turn a profit and compete with other service providers. This decreases the resources available to the beneficiary and innovators. In a broken market, the beneficiary is no longer the customer because someone else foots the bill. Because the entire transaction is a pure loss for all parties, there is enormous downward pressure on the price the customer will pay. And because of the capitalist golden rule, he who has the gold makes the rules, customers will only pay for innovations that serve their interest before the beneficiary's interest. In a functioning market, I can say, if you buy my widget for $50, you will make $100. In a broken market, I can say, if you buy my widget for $50, I can make your $100 have $10,000 of impact. The customer replies, that's great. Here's 50 cents. Here is how to recognize broken markets. They respond to overwhelming loss rather than profit opportunity. They involve at least 3 parties rather than 2. All transactions are disincentivized losses, which are illustrated here by the red dollar signs. They focus on decreasing cost, not increasing value or ROI. The funder or service provider is the customer, not the beneficiary. The customer's interest is very limited. They will only fund whatever is in their interest, which may or may not be in the beneficiary's interest. Broken markets are always accompanied by a social ill. Fortunately, the cost of creating value in a broken market is cheap, but value does not create a profit, so it never attracts investment. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time or detail, but broken markets can have functioning sub-markets. Most sub-markets are very small compared to the total external loss of the parent broken market. A functioning sub-market does not change the overall loss nature of the macro broken market. Here's a small list of broken markets. Each of these markets has a funder, usually government, philanthropy, or private donors, who partially cover an overwhelming cost or loss suffered by a beneficiary. Government is often stuck with broken markets. Making a list of major government agencies and social programs is a quick way to identify major broken markets. Silicon Valley's response to broken markets has been frankly disgraceful and has tainted the entire technology industry. Silicon Valley's first and most common reaction is to turn a blind eye to broken markets and simply ignore them in favor of more lucrative functioning markets. The second most common response is hubris, a blind belief that anyone who creates value should be able to turn a profit, period. In my experience, a majority of Silicon Valley technologists truly believe that anyone who's not turning a profit is either dumb or not trying hard enough. I will believe this argument the day anyone creates a technology that turns your city health department into a profit center. The third common response, and the most dangerous, is to assert that broken markets simply don't exist. This is an extreme version of number 2. As a result, technology has become synonymous with profit, and the entire technology industry generally does not engage with broken markets. Stunned that crisis cleanup has created enormous value without being profitable, hundreds of people with whom I've spoken have insisted they could easily make the system turn a profit. Every one of these conversations involves the other person saying, "Have you ever thought about?" On behalf of every entrepreneur and humanitarian who has persevered in his or her field for more than about 2 years, I ask you to eliminate that phrase from your vocabulary. People often use this phrase to introduce a well-intentioned suggestion, but the answer to the question, "Have you ever thought about?" is always the same. Yes, yes, after years of toiling in my field, I have thought about whatever you are going to suggest after thinking about the issue for 5 minutes. In fact, I've tried it more than once. Instead, if you want to make a helpful suggestion, start with the phrase, "What has your experience been?" and then continue. Doing so conveys professional respect and humility. It recognizes that your wisdom, however substantial, is probably no substitute for the person's lived experience. If you do this, I will make you a promise on behalf of all of us. We will be grateful for the respect and tell you if somehow you make a completely new and novel suggestion we've never thought about. With that side note out of the way, that leaves us back with the main question. How do you sustainably solve problems in broken markets? To answer that question, we first need to analyze why the status quo is not working. As Americans, we love free competitive markets. Competition drives innovation in functioning markets. Competitors fight over profit, which regulates costs for consumers. Affordable innovation increases the quality of life for customers who can pay. Competition requires scarcity or control. As we all learned growing up playing the game Monopoly, you can make a higher profit when you control access to resources like hotels. Capitalism 101 tells you to create value, control access to that value, then charge others to benefit from the value. If everyone has your widget or service, the price falls and it becomes a commodity. Copyright, trademark, and patent protections control access to intellectual property so that innovators can charge for access to their innovations and hopefully drive additional innovation. However, competitive markets waste a lot of money. For example, competitors must each pay for their own research and development instead of sharing notes. Competitive markets are wasteful in other ways. Many markets rely on society to bear their costs, often in the form of blight, pollution, economic inequality, or natural resource depletion. We are now in the midst of a global discussion about how much cost society is willing to bear to reap the benefits that many competitive markets produce. Broken markets work differently. Organizations still fight over market share, but competitive broken markets are really bad at delivering value to beneficiaries because there are more middlemen, each taking a cut. There are now two sets of competitors. Innovators compete against other innovators, and service providers compete against other service providers. Competition forces innovators and service providers to duplicate efforts and not share resources, wasting already limited funding. The service provider or funder is now the customer, not the beneficiary. Any innovation will serve their interest first. When service providers are the customers, they usually shape innovation to maintain their competitive advantage against other service providers rather than increase impact to beneficiaries. This is why Haiti is known as the land of 10,000 NGOs, while showing limited progress on humanitarian issues, and it's why the Bahamas is heading the same direction. It is why long-term recovery groups struggle after disasters, and why food banks never have enough food. Fortunately, there is a path to solve problems in broken markets. Use collaboration and commodities to minimize waste. First, stop funding outcomes. Measure outcomes, but start funding and incentivizing collaboration. Funding outcomes seems natural, but it makes service providers compete, which actually hurts outcomes. To be clear, I am not arguing for monopolies. More community participation in broken markets always produces better outcomes. Instead, I am arguing that we incentivize competitors to collaborate. Funding collaboration encourages sharing, but requires funders to be actively engaged with the groups they fund. Just like crisis cleanups rules, funders need to create customized collaboration rules to get coalitions of competitors to work together. Funders cannot just write a check to one of the competitors and expect everything to work out. Without thoughtful engagement, it is possible to miss the mark. For example, a colleague told me about a federal initiative to encourage interagency collaboration, but the program defined collaborating as meeting together. This incentivized a bunch of additional meetings that wasted everyone's time. In contrast, consider a project I'm currently working on, a trusted partner capacity directory. Each of us receives emails asking us to complete a survey about our organization's contact information and capacities. If you're like me, you probably delete most of these requests. I would argue you do this because all of those surveys have one thing in common. They benefit someone else, not you. The Trusted Partner Capacity Directory turns the incentives upside down. In this system, you may download an updated directory of your colleagues at any time. The cost is that the system will occasionally ask you whether you know people in your network and whether their contact information is up to date. The system asks you for a small amount of information and in return gives you a large amount of information, thus incentivizing you to collaborate. And as a result, the system becomes, to a degree, self-maintaining. If you were to develop funding metrics that encourage collaboration, some examples might include developing native interoperability and API connections, decentralizing control over data and systems, data sharing among organizations, bringing more organizations from the community to the table, the number and quality of interorganizational relationships as measured by the other organization, the number of multi-organization cooperative projects, the extent of participation by marginalized communities, and so on. This principle suggests several possible realignments of the broken market diagram I shared earlier. Perhaps funders should give beneficiaries the right to direct how funds are allocated. Or perhaps funders could give funds directly to beneficiaries with contractual limitations. This would set up an artificial functioning market between the beneficiary and service provider. Or perhaps we pay innovators only when they developed decentralized, federated, interoperable systems. These are simply ideas and a framework to start the conversation rather than tested solutions. The second part of the equation is to innovate using commodities. We must innovate on the trailing edge of technology, not the leading edge. Solving large social ills requires the participation of the entire community, beneficiaries and the public, not just funders and service providers. Technology solutions must be available to a broad audience. We must use existing, readily available components to create new solutions for two reasons. First, commodities are cheap. Second, commodities are common. Innovating on the trailing edge of technology requires a ton of work, but it's not flashy or profitable. We aren't metaphorically inventing the internal combustion engine or automatic transmission. We're sizing the chassis with the wheels, installing the glass and putting the doors on. Hopefully we'll have enough money for a steering wheel. AI, laser cutters, 3D printers, drones, RFIDs, and blockchain are really cool, and we can imagine some amazing applications for disaster relief, homelessness, addiction recovery, and veteran services. But it will take another decade for those technologies to be universally available enough to help the most socially vulnerable. If the goal is to serve broken markets and solve real problems, then stop looking for new flashy gadgets. We need companies to either dump a bunch of money into innovations that will never turn a profit, or simply acknowledge that they don't participate in broken markets, take their toys and go home. Here in broken market land, we get the scraps of technology, because that's what our clients can afford. We serve the people who make really bad customers, because they've lost everything. Blockchain, AI, CNC routers, drones, or 3D printers will help solve social ills only after they become mass-produced commodities easy enough for grandma to use and available in thrift stores. For example, a colleague recently designed a cell phone app that faith communities can use to determine if their members are okay after disasters. Members simply log in and check in. However, they were having problems implementing the system. "We told Grandma to log in," he said, and completely lost her. I showed him an app that I had created called Crisis Caller. This app preloads the names and locations of any large group of people. After the disaster, the group leader, such as a pastor, sends out phone calls to everyone. The phone message says something like, "On behalf of Pastor Bob, please tell us how you're doing. Press 0 if you're okay. Press 1 if your power's out. Press 2 if your home is flooding. Press 3 if you have debris in your yard," and so on. The call follows up with a question about severity. How many feet of water? How many pickup truck loads of debris? How much difficulty the power outage is causing, and so on. As soon as the person presses a number, a dot appears on a shared map. Leaders can not only see where the problem exists, but what areas are not affected. Unreachable phone numbers are also reported, which can provide insight into the extent of the disaster. When multiple community organizations use the system, Pastor Bob may not hear from Jane Smith, who has a health condition. However, if someone down the street from a different organization reported 3 feet of water, then you probably know what Jane is experiencing. We've rolled out this program in 5 disasters and used it to quickly poll 10,000 people in 2 hours. It's not a cell phone app. There is no login required. This is what innovating on the trailing edge of technology looks like. We need to move toward collaboration and innovating on the trailing edge of technology. But until we can change funding and innovation culture, I will suggest 11 possible business models for broken markets. None of them are easy, and all of them have significant drawbacks. The first is powered by neurosis. There's a fine line between dedication and neurosis. This model relies on some idiot to keep working long after he should have gone home. This has been Crisis Cleanup's business model for most of the past 8 years, and you can guess who the idiot is. Essentially, this model means running your operation on volunteer labor. The benefits are cheap, dedicated labor and a strong focus on the mission. The drawbacks are organizational fragility, financial strain, and a significant hit-by-a-bus risk. In the past, capitalism invented indentured servitude as a method for addressing broken markets. In a pure open market without constraints, a beneficiary would bargain with her only asset, her labor. She would convince an investor to provide her cash, and in exchange she would pledge her indentured servitude until the investor returned a profit. Of course, substituting one social ill for another is not a real solution, and fortunately we have decided that indentured servitude and slavery are bad and illegal. You could always get lucky and have someone come to your rescue with all the money you need, like some rich uncle or angel donor. You could also get struck by lightning, but if I were you, I would not spend much time thinking about any of these. The next option is to create for-profit and non-profit versions of your technology system. Then fund your do-gooding with the for-profit activities. It sounds good, but this model is frankly a myth. There are 2 fundamental problems with this approach. First, running a startup that breaks even takes more than all of your energy and attention. Running a startup that is so wildly profitable that it can fund your do-good activities and free your attention is about as likely as winning the lottery. So go buy a lotto ticket instead and save yourself the time. Second, any for-profit service will need to be designed around principles of competition and scarcity. You will need to radically adapt your tech architecture for broken markets to enable collaborative environments of abundance. Maintaining both branches of your code will be cost prohibitive. The next business model is to make a profit from a functioning submarket. The military-industrial complex is perhaps the largest example of a very large functioning submarket within the larger broken market of national defense. Other examples are the functioning submarkets of domestic surveillance within the larger broken market of homeland security, or disaster relief technology built exclusively for government agencies within the larger broken market of disaster relief. The primary benefit to serving a functioning submarket is that you can turn a profit. The drawback is that you serve only the customer and not necessarily the beneficiary. For example, citizens are the beneficiaries of homeland security. Yet, widespread domestic surveillance works against the interest of individual citizens. Crisis Cleanup is working on serving functioning submarkets by providing aggregated reports to government agencies, but we need to be vigilant that we don't accidentally lose our focus on the beneficiaries in the process, undermining the trust required to make the system run. The next business model is to sell ego. When you think about it, most technology does exactly this. Individuals, corporations, and governments will pay a lot of money for someone to tell them that they are at the center of the community or top of the pyramid. This business model is a slippery slope. On one hand, selling white-labeled versions of a collaborative technology system is probably good because they are more likely to feel ownership in the product and be willing to fund upgrades. However, to successfully implement this model, you must be willing to say no to any feature that would decrease collaboration, increase controller scarcity, or change the architecture to exclude others from the commons. For example, discussions about the customer owning the data, which is code for making sure nobody else has the information, or implementing strict hierarchical approvals about what organizations can see what information, are red flags. The next business model is begging and grants. You rely on relationships to beg for money from interested third parties. This has been Crisis Cleanup's most successful strategy to date. But begging is unpredictable and covers only a small portion of the total costs. The next option is for one big guy to pay for a bunch of little guys. This has happened in disaster relief, but it eventually fell apart. The big guy paying the bills is not responsive to the needs of the little guys who use the technology. The technology is better than anything else, but has not been updated in a decade. The next model is to get a tech company to donate some of their tech. The benefit to this approach is that you get free tech. However, you cannot count on getting the support or customization you need, and sometimes integrating free technology costs more than the savings. This has happened to me many times. For example, during Hurricane Harvey, we were trying to integrate a third-party Spanish translating system into our phone system. Microsoft contacted me and offered Skype for Business for free for a month. This was nice, but it would have cost me $10,000 to integrate. I would have to start paying for it after a month, and it turns out the technology wouldn't integrate with the third-party Spanish translators, which was the original problem. Be careful about the technology partners you choose to take on, and be very clear about what they are offering, for how long, and how much it will cost to integrate, customize, and support. You may have heard of the company Four Oceans. They are a for-profit company that has mastered the marketing concept called the humble brag. They sell overpriced trinkets, decals, and bracelets made of recycled plastic recovered from the ocean. And for each $20 bracelet you buy, they promise to remove 1 pound of plastic from the ocean. In return, you get to wear your bracelet or decal and humbly brag to your friends about what a good steward of the earth you are. This model can be lucrative if you are performing a service that the public feels empowered to tackle and is popular all the time, and not just a temporary news story. Most social ills and broken markets like adult literacy or affordable housing do not command that type of sustained public attention. In addition, building a mass market public brand is very expensive. The last broken market business model is to find a coalition of competitors who agree to fundraise for the greater good. The group then provides technology to everyone within the coalition. This model shows a great deal of promise, but has not been proven. The closest real-world version of this model is when trade associations provide member benefits. I've applied this model to other technology projects as well. These are shovel-ready and waiting for funding. We don't have time to give each of them the attention they deserve. Some of them include the Trusted Partner Capacity Director and Crisis Caller, which I mentioned earlier, disaster donations management, and community volunteerism. Each deserve their own presentation, and I will be happy to explore these ideas at length with anyone who's willing to talk. If you want to solve really difficult problems, incentivize collaboration, and innovate on the trailing edge of technology. Thank you.